In Magic the Gathering, uncommons aren't usually very expensive. After all, it's the second lowest rarity in the game, and booster packs tend to have multiples of them. However, there are some uncommons out there that are in such high demand and or in such low supply that they still have a pretty high price tag, despite the fact that they don't have a higher rarity. In this video, we're going to take a look at Magic's 10 most expensive red uncommons, and I'll explain what makes them so expensive. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want Magic singles or sealed product, use my link in the description. Before we get to the list, let me discuss the methodology of this video. The prices in it are Card Kingdom near mint prices, and they are the price for the cheapest tournament legal printing of a card. In other words, something like Alpha Orcish Artillery isn't going to appear here. Sure, it's an uncommon that's worth $450, but you can also get your hands on a tournament legal near mint printing of it for 35 cents. In other words, the prices in this video are the least amount you can pay for a near mint copy of the card, regardless of the printing. Furthermore, a card had to be an uncommon in its original printing to be eligible for the list. Alright, with that out of the way, let's look at the 10 most expensive red uncommons, starting with Untimely Malfunction. It costs about $7.50. It's one generic and a red for an instant, and it's a modal spell with 3 options. You can destroy an artifact, you can change the target of a spell or ability with a single target, or you can make 2 creatures unable to block this turn. This modality is pretty sweet, as all 3 of these effects can be pretty narrow. If your opponent doesn't have an artifact, the first mode doesn't matter. If they don't cast a spell or use an ability with a target, the second one doesn't matter. And if you can't do something meaningful in combat by making 2 things unable to block, that doesn't really matter either. But the great news is that when you do have a use for these modes, especially for the first 2, it's a good spell. Maybe Shatter isn't exciting, but paying 2 to deal with an artifact is solid, and paying 1 generic and a red to redirect a spell is actually a really good rate. When you can use that on a removal spell and make it hit their own creature, you get a very efficient 2-for-1. Despite being a new card that was just printed last year, Untimely Malfunction is already seeing play in every 60-card format, as it's just one of the best modal spells we've ever seen. It's largely a sideboard card, but an important one in many decks. It's also already a heavily played card in Commander. Whenever a card is this new, and from a standard release set that is still in print, it's usually pretty difficult for an uncommon to have such a high price tag, but Untimely Malfunction is a card that is desired by players of literally every sanctioned 60-card format it's legal in, and Commander players, and that's a recipe for a high price tag, one that's only going to go up when Duskmourn cards become harder to find. At number 9, it's Magnetic Theft, which costs $7.79. For 1 red mana, it's an instant that allows you to attach target equipment to target creature. Sure, it's situational, but moving an equipment at instant speed can have devastating results in the right situation, and you can even use this on equipment you don't control. Yes, your opponent still technically controls the equipment, but they have to pay the equip cost to get it off of your creature, and they can't do that at instant speed. So stealing an equipment off of their creature and putting it on yours can result in combat really being turned on its head. So throw in the fact you can also use it to move your own equipment around at instant speed, and at what is usually going to be a big discount, and we have a pretty interesting card on our hands. It's also really unique, something that also helps drive up a card's price. Magnetic Theft went a very long time without anyone in 60-card formats playing it, but since 2020, it has sometimes seen play in an equipment-focused deck in Modern called Hammer Time. This deck uses equipment with huge equip costs, and the goal is usually to move them for free with either Sigarda's Aid or Pure Steel Paladin. While Magnetic Theft has by no means become a card that regularly appears in these decks, it does show up sometimes, making it a card with at least some small demand in Modern. It also regularly appears in equipment decks in Commander, though the demand there isn't through the roof either. But Magnetic Theft has never been reprinted, with its only appearance coming in 2004's Fifth Dawn, so the supply for this card still can't keep up with the demand, since there aren't that many Magnetic Thefts out there. It's kind of interesting seeing Untimely Malfunction and Magnetic Theft appear back to back, since Magnetic Theft has about 10% of the demand that Untimely Malfunction does, and they still end up at about the same price. But appearing in one set more than 2 decades ago is a lot different than a card that was just printed last year. At number 8, it's Price of Progress, which costs about $8. For 1 generic and a red, it's an instant that deals damage to each player equal to twice the number of non-basic lands that player controls. This is simply one of the most efficient ways to hate on a player packing a bunch of non-basics, especially if you're an aggressive red deck, as this can do insane amounts of damage for only 2 mana. This incredible efficiency led to Price of Progress seeing play in both standard and extended back in the day, but these days when it comes to 60-card formats, it's highly in demand among legacy players. That format is loaded with lots of decks that lean on non-basics, including one that is made up almost entirely by them, the Legacy Lands deck, which looks to assemble and tutor up powerful lands for given situations, and can also combo off with them. Non-basics are so prevalent in Legacy that the price even sees regular main deck play in decks like Burn and Delver, and it can be found in a significantly wider swath of sideboards. The price is also a very good card in Commander, as it hits all players, and non-basics are everywhere in the format. Do keep in mind it's symmetrical though, that comes up less in Legacy, but in Commander, if you're not careful, you could burn yourself pretty badly too. So the price is in fairly high demand in both Legacy and Commander, and the supply of the card isn't exactly plentiful. Since the original printing in Exodus, it's only been brought back in very limited release sets like Dual Decks and Eternal Masters, as well as the List, which was a subset of curated cards that used to appear in collector boosters. This has definitely increased the supply of the price. It used to be even more expensive, but its price tag of $8 was still enough to earn it a spot on this list. At number 7, it's Kobold Drill Sergeant, which costs $9.50. For one generic and a red, it's a 1/2 that gives other kobolds +0/+1 and trample. This card is kind of hilarious, not just because of the art and flavor text, but because of the very weird design choices. Most kobolds, especially back in Legends, are 0/1s, so it's not like giving them +0/+1 and trample is going to make much of a difference. I mean, the very fact that they have this give trample and a toughness boost is kind of silly on its own, but Legends was a very early Magic set, and they were still feeling things out. Anyway, as you can probably guess from the way I'm roasting this card, this isn't exactly a card anyone cares about for competitive purposes. It's barely played in Commander, and has never top-8'd anything, so this is a case where the extreme scarcity of the card is really the only force driving up its price. The Drill Sergeant was only printed once, in 1994's Legends, so the few people out there who do want one, either because they want to collect the entire set or build a Kobold deck for some reason, they have to pay a premium. At number 6, it's General Kreat the Boltbringer, who costs about $11. For 2 generic and a red, he's a 2/2 goblin, and whenever one or more goblins you control attack, you create a 1/1 red goblin creature token that's tapped and attacking, and whenever another creature you control enters, General Kreat does 1 damage to each opponent. So Kreat can crank out tokens while also dishing out some serious damage, both when the tokens he makes enters and when any other creatures enter. General Kreat is from Foundation's Jumpstart, and like other Jumpstart exclusive cards, the only 60-card formats he's legal in are Legacy and Vintage. He's relatively new, but has already seen some play in Goblin decks in Legacy, which have powerhouses like Muxus, who loves putting Kreat into play with his Enters trigger, and Broadside Bombardiers, which can find plenty to do with the extra tokens that Kreat generates. He's also fairly popular in Commander, where red decks that generate lots of tokens always love this kind of effect. He's basically a miniature Purphoros who loves goblins and comes with a built-in way to trigger his own effect, making him a fairly powerful and effective commander. While Kreat is the newest card on the list, even newer than Untimely Malfunction, he's even harder to find, because Jumpstart packs are a supplementary product that is produced in fewer numbers than a mainstream set, so being exclusive to those means that it's pretty hard to find General Kreat, in spite of just having been printed about 9 months ago. This, combined with moderate demand in Legacy and significant demand in Commander, is enough to drive his price all the way to $11. At number 5, it's Pyrohemia, which costs about $11.50. Planar Chaos had a bunch of color-shifted cards, basically callbacks to well-known Magic cards, but printed in a different color, where the effects still make sense in the color pie, and Pyrohemia is a color-shifted Pestilence. For 2 generic and 2 red, it's an enchantment, and you can pay 1 red to do 1 damage to each creature and each player. At the beginning of the end step, if no creatures are on the battlefield, you sacrifice it. Basically, you can use this to obliterate the board and or players, making it a very powerful effect that is 1 part board sweeper, 1 part removal, and 1 part burn spell. Pyrohemia has only been played a tiny bit in 60-card formats, achieving 1 top 8 in Modern, but like most effects that let you have a major impact on the entire board of every player, it's fairly heavily played in Commander. It can be good in just about any red deck, but it can be particularly spicy with commanders who can augment damage, or that like being damaged, such as O'Hare Axonil, who can make each activation of Pyrohemia do 4 to each of your opponents. Still, this amount of play in Commander wouldn't normally be enough to elevate a card's price tag this much, but this is another card that's hard to find. Since being printed in Planar Chaos, Pyrohemia has only shown up in a single Commander Precon, in the Commander Anthology, and as a card on the list, and none of those are easy ways to obtain this powerful enchantment. At number 4, it's Winds of Change. For 1 red mana, it's a sorcery that has each player shuffle the cards from their hand into their library and then draw that many cards. This kind of effect might be symmetrical, but it's also super powerful for only 1 mana, and this is really the only Wheel of Fortune-like effect that is this cheap. It lets you re-roll your entire hand, and while your opponent gets to do that too, there are plenty of ways to break the symmetry on this kind of card. For example, the one top 8 it has achieved in 60 card formats came in a Legacy Dredge deck, which could use the immense number of draws to mill their entire library once Golgari Thug and his friends are in the graveyard, since anytime you would draw a card, you can instead choose to mill cards equal to a card in your graveyard's dredge value, and then return that card to your hand. In Commander, there are even more viable ways to break the symmetry, like with Nekusar, who damages your opponent for drawing cards, or Niv-Mizzet Perrin, who lets you turn every card you draw into a ping on any target. This is particularly effective in Commander, since it'll end up letting you punish all of your opponents, since Winds of Change makes every player shuffle their hand away and draw a new one. This is, of course, another fairly scarce red uncommon. Since its printing in Legends, it has been reprinted, but only in 4th and 5th editions, which are very old core sets, and Portal, which is a very old beginner product. The most recent printings of Winds of Change have been in Secret Lair and Mystery Booster form. The Mystery Booster printing has helped lower the price on this card some, but it's still one of the most expensive red uncommons in the game. I just told you about Winds of Change, and I'm also trying to bring about some change to my subscriber count. I'm trying to reach 100,000 subscribers this year, so I'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe and help me get there. Even if you think you're already subscribed, double check because more than half of my viewers aren't subscribed. At number 3, it's Goblin Lackey, which costs about $13. For 1 red mana, the Lackey is a 1/1, and when it does damage to an opponent, you can put a goblin from your hand onto the battlefield. That makes this an absolutely terrifying 1-drop in Goblin decks, since you can put something amazing onto the battlefield for free on turn 2, and everyone knows goblins get scary the more of them that are on the battlefield, and the Lackey can really snowball if it isn't dealt with. It's also nice that it counts any kind of damage the Lackey does, so you don't necessarily need to get in for combat damage. When the Lackey was originally printed in 1998, it wasn't very good. In fact, it didn't see play anywhere. There just weren't powerful enough goblins in Magic. This led to it not doing anything in 60-card formats for the first several years of its existence. However, that all started to change in 2002 when Onslaught Block showed up on the scene with a very heavy goblin theme and lots of crazy powerful goblins. Now you could put Goblin Warchief, Goblin Piledriver, or Siege Gang Commander into play for no mana on turn 2, and that made Goblin decks in Extended completely broken. They ran roughshod over the format from 2002 to 2003 until the Lackey got banned, and it remained banned for as long as it was legal in Extended. Goblin decks remained very strong in Legacy though, with the Lackey always being legal there, and while Goblin decks have had ups and downs in the format over the last 2+ decades, Goblin decks have virtually always been at least somewhat viable in the format, and at times they've been incredible. They're pretty good right now, and the printing of Muxus Goblin Grandee has led to it becoming the new favorite goblin to cheat into play with the Lackey, which makes it even easier for you to have an absolutely absurd board in the extreme early game, because Muxus's interest trigger puts every goblin in your top 6 cards directly on the battlefield. Meanwhile, the Lackey is also a regular feature in Goblin Commander decks for obvious reasons, so there's some significant demand out there for this little goblin, and it's only been printed in a standard release set with a normal print run a single time. In 1998's Urza's Saga, there are some Secret Lair and other premium versions of the Lackey out there, and it's another card that got a reprint in Mystery Booster 2, and as with Winds of Change, that has driven down the Lackey's price a few bucks, but it's still a costly uncommon because it's one of the best goblins ever printed. At number 2, it's Treasonous Ogre, which costs about $15. For 3 generic and a red, it's a 2/3 with Dethrone. That means when it attacks the player with the most life or tied for the most life, it gets a +1/+1 counter. You can also pay 3 life to add 1 red mana to your mana pool. Yeah, it hurts, but Treasonous Ogre lets you produce mana for no mana at all, and if you've got enough life, you can make some absurd mana with it. And of course, paying all of that life also means you can set up the Ogre's Dethrone so it'll trigger, but, most of the card's power comes from that activated ability. I mean, it's basically a way more painful, more expensive channel that can only produce red mana, but even a heavily nerfed channel is a card with some serious power. The Ogre is from a Conspiracy set, and that means the only 60-card formats it's legal in are Legacy and Vintage, and it's not quite good enough to have broken through in either of those formats, but it does see significant play in Commander, where it's at its best since the starting life total is 40 instead of 20, making it possible to go really crazy with the Ogre. It gets particularly good with commanders who can turn this effect into even more upside, like Rowan, Scion of War, who makes your black and red spells 1 mana cheaper for each life you've lost in a turn. This means between the Ogre's ability to generate mana and Rowan's ability to decrease costs, you could pretty much cast anything you want in a given turn. Overall, given how powerful it is, the Ogre is probably underplayed in Commander, but that's partly because $15 is a hefty price tag. I can guarantee you that if it was a 35-cent card, its EDH rec data would make it look like a format staple. But alas, Treasonous Ogre is one of the most expensive red uncommons around, and that's because it has some very significant demand among Commander players, and it's only been printed in limited release sets like Conspiracy, The List, and A Secret Lair. And at number 1, I've got 3 cards, and I put them together because they're all red uncommons from Portal 3 Kingdoms. Those cards are Rockslide Ambush, which costs about $22, Ravaging Horde, which costs about $15, and Imperial Recruiter, which costs about $14. The Ambush and Horde would be number 1 and number 2 if they had their own slots, while the Recruiter would be at number 4, in between Treasonous Ogre and Goblin Lackey. Portal 3 Kingdoms virtually always makes appearances on most expensive lists, and that's because the set is incredibly unique and incredibly rare. It was released only in Asian markets as a standalone beginner version of Magic. For this release, they made the game a lot easier to understand by limiting the number of card types and adding a sword and shield to creatures so that you could more easily remember which was power and which was toughness. Portal 3 Kingdoms and other Portal sets weren't even legal in Magic in any format until 2005, when cards from those sets became legal in Legacy and Vintage. So let's start our discussion with Imperial Recruiter because it's the cheapest of the 3, and there's also way more to say about it. For 2 generic and a red, it's a 1/1, and when it enters, you tutor up a creature with power 2 or less and put it into your hand. Most of the time, Portal 3 Kingdom cards are expensive almost exclusively because they're rare, and most of them have never been played in 60-card formats, and hardly anyone uses them in Commander. But that is not the story with Imperial Recruiter. It's one of the few Portal 3 Kingdom cards that immediately became relevant in 2005 when they made these sets legal. It's been played in Legacy fairly regularly ever since then, often getting used in combo decks that are reliant on creatures that it can tutor up, because it makes your deck way more consistent. For example, it's often been played in Allurin decks, which look to get that enchantment in play so that they can cast creatures with mana value 3 or less at instant speed, and for free. This includes the Recruiter, of course, who can help you find your Cavern Harpy, a creature that makes you return a blue or black creature to your hand when it enters, and it can return to your hand on its own when you pay 1 life. Then you combine the Harpy with something like Auriok Champion or Maggot Carrier to make your opponent lose all their life, since they can just keep recasting the Harpy and Carrier and bouncing the Carrier. While the Allurin combos have varied over the years, the Recruiter is usually able to grab the most important pieces. It's been used more, though, in Painter's Servant decks, which look to combine that tutorable creature with Grindstone. Activating the stone with the Servant in play mills your opponent's entire deck. For a long time, the Recruiter only saw play in Legacy, but then in 2021, it got a reprint in Modern Horizons 2, becoming legal in that format for the first time, and it's seen regular play in that format as well, often in Hate Bear style decks. These decks tend to be less about combos and more about playing disruptive creatures that really hate on specific strategies, and the Recruiter can find you whatever silver bullet you need, whether it's a Kitesail Freebooter to pick apart their hand, a Thalia to slow them down, or even Grist Hungertide, a Planeswalker the Recruiter can grab since it counts as a 1/1 creature when it's in your deck. It has slowed down in Modern of late, but it's still fairly active in Legacy, and of all the cards on this list, it's also the most heavily played in Commander, a format where tutors tend to thrive as a result of the format's singleton nature. All of that would usually mean that the Recruiter's price would be absolutely absurd, and for a time it was, since it was in one of the rarest sets of all time and people actually wanted it. If I did this video before it got reprinted in Masters 25, Double Masters, and then Modern Horizons 2, it would very easily be the number 1 card on the list, as it once cost more than $150. But luckily, Wizards of the Coast has reprinted it a bunch over the last several years, keeping it from having a completely absurd price tag. So yeah, the point here is that the Recruiter is actually a really good card from Portal 3 Kingdoms, something only a handful of cards from the set can really say. The story of Rockslide Ambush and Ravaging Horde's prices is more typical of cards from the set, as neither of them have ever been successful in 60-card formats, nor is there much demand for them in Commander, although to be honest, both of them are also better than your typical Portal 3 Kingdoms cards, which are often laughably bad. Ravaging Horde is 3 generic and 2 red mana for a 3/3 that destroys a land when it enters, and Rockslide Ambush is 1 generic and a red for a sorcery that deals damage to target creature equal to the number of mountains you control. So the Horde is a respectable way to add to the board and mess with your opponent's mana, and the Rockslide is an okay removal spell, but neither of those are cards that people are desperate to play anywhere, so their price is largely a result of how rare they are because they've never ever been reprinted. So those are Magic's most expensive red uncommons. If you want to own any of these cards, most of which are also quite powerful, you should check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you're interested in more NTG top 10s, including more of them that look at the most expensive cards in the game, you should see a couple of playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.